the shattered sanctuary, the P-51 Mustang, and the fall of Japanese air superiority. The impossible sight on the morning of April 7, 1945, the frigid air high above Tokyo Bay, was not merely a meteorological condition. It was the physical manifestation of a dying empire's last, desperate illusion of security. Pressing his face against the cold glass of his gun sight, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, a veteran ace of the Imperial Japanese Navy, witnessed a scene that defied all known principles of aerial combat and shattered the foundational assumptions of his nation's military doctrine. Circling at an altitude of 25,000 feet was an armada of American B-29 superfortresses, but it was their guardians that stole Sakai's breath, causing it to condense in sharp, panicked puffs inside his oxygen mask. These were not the twin-tailed P-38 Lightnings, which were known, however improbably, to make the long-distance journey on rare occasions. These were single-engine fighters, sleek, predatory, and infuriatingly numerous. For 3 long years, the High Command in Tokyo had assured its pilots that the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean was their ultimate shield. The distances were too immense, the fuel requirements too prohibitive, the logistical challenges too insurmountable for any American single-engine fighter to ever threaten the sacred home islands. Yet there they were, 96 silver specks, their distinctive bubble canopies glinting in the sun, a direct and brazen violation of Japanese strategic dogma. The mathematics of this sight were irrefutable and were writing the final devastating chapter in the history of Japanese air superiority. Iwo Jima, a tiny blood-soaked speck of volcanic rock, lay 750 statute miles to the south, a round trip of 1,500 miles over the world's most unforgiving ocean, 8 hours confined to a cramped cockpit, fuel consumption figures that should have been a fantasy. The Americans had not only imagined this fantasy, they had engineered it into reality. The North American P-51D Mustang, propelled by the magnificent Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with revolutionary external fuel tank technology, had just obliterated Japan's last remaining defensive advantage. The psychological blow to the Japanese pilots, the demoralizing realization that their sanctuary had been irrevocably breached, would ultimately prove more catastrophic than any single military defeat. The key to the sky, the battle for Iwo Jima. The genesis of this aerial revolution was as brutal as it was strategic. The crisis for Japan had begun to crystallize on February 19, 1945, when waves of United States Marines stormed the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. This volcanic island, a mere 8 square miles of jagged rock and shifting ash, was strategically perched exactly 750 miles south of Tokyo. To the Japanese High Command, Iwo Jima was another fortified outpost in a rapidly collapsing defensive perimeter, a place to bleed the Americans and delay the inevitable. To American strategists, however, it was the essential linchpin, the singular key that would unlock the skies over the Japanese homeland. The battle for the island was a 36-day descent into hell, a brutal close-quarters meat grinder that cost the lives of 6,121 Americans and left 19,217 wounded. The Japanese defense was fanatical. Nearly the entire garrison of 21,000 soldiers fought to the death, entombed in an elaborate network of caves and bunkers. Yet even as Marines were still clearing these final pockets of resistance with flamethrowers and grenades, often hearing the last desperate cries of Japanese soldiers from the depths of the earth, American combat engineers were already transforming the island's 3 captured airfields. Their mission was singular and urgent, to extend the runways and build the infrastructure necessary to host a very specific, war-winning weapon. The pace was breathtaking. On March 6th, a mere 2 weeks after the initial landings, and 10 days before the island was officially declared secure, the first P-51 Mustangs of the 15th Fighter Group skidded to a landing on Iwo Jima's central field. The pilots, emerging from their cockpits expecting an established base, were immediately handed entrenching tools and ordered to dig their own foxholes. The battle was not a memory. It was an ongoing reality. Japanese soldiers, emerging like ghosts from hidden caves, launched nightly suicide attacks. The airmen lived in a surreal, hellish landscape with no tents or permanent structures, surrounded by the pervasive, acrid stench of sulfur from Mount Suribachi, their lives punctuated by the distant, persistent booms of artillery from the northern part of the island, where the fighting still raged. Major James Tapp, a squadron commander, surveyed this desolate new home. Black volcanic sand stretched to the horizon, a stark, monochrome vista of devastation. The very air was thick with the smells of death and gunpowder mixed with the planet's primordial exhalations. This was the forward operating base from which America intended to prove Japanese intelligence catastrophically wrong. Tokyo lay 750 miles to the north-northwest, and between Iwo Jima and the enemy capital stretched nothing but the empty, immense, and merciless Pacific Ocean. The unprecedented challenge. Forging the Sunsetters. The preparation for these monumental missions had begun months earlier. The 7th Fighter Command, nicknamed the Sunsetters, had been specifically tasked with training for this unparalleled challenge, escorting B-29 bombers from Iwo Jima to the heart of Japan and back. The mission profile they faced was unprecedented in the annals of aerial warfare. Pilots would be required to fly for 3 hours across a featureless ocean to reach their target, engage in intense, high-stakes combat for 30 to 90 minutes over the most heavily defended targets on Earth, and then summon the focus for another 3-hour overwater flight home. Total mission time would regularly exceed 8 hours. There would be no rescue ships positioned along the route, no friendly alternate landing fields. The equation was brutally simple: make it back to Iwo Jima or perish in the trackless void of the Pacific. The instrument that made this audacious strategy possible was the P-51 Mustang, a strong contender for the title of the finest fighter aircraft of the Second World War. Its elegant laminar flow wings, incredibly efficient cooling system, and, most importantly, its powerful Packard Merlin V1657 engine, producing 1,695 horsepower, allowed it to reach breathtaking speeds of 437 miles per hour at altitude. Yet, in the context of the Pacific War, speed, while critical, was secondary to one paramount attribute: range. Everything was defined by endurance. The standard P-51 carried 184 gallons of internal fuel within its wings. An additional 85-gallon tank could be fitted behind the pilot's seat, though this created dangerous center of gravity issues, making the aircraft sluggish and unresponsive when full. The true breakthrough, the technological leap that rendered the 750-mile gap obsolete, came in the form of externally mounted jettisonable drop tanks. 2 110-gallon aluminum tanks, mounted beneath the wings, could extend the Mustang's combat radius to over 850 miles. With meticulous fuel management, this gave the P-51 a maximum ferry range approaching 1,600 miles, just enough to reach Tokyo from Iwo Jima, fight, and return with a slim, nerve-wracking reserve for emergencies and combat. This drop tank technology was itself a masterpiece of American industrial might and mass production. Manufactured from pressed paper or lightweight aluminum, these expendable fuel containers were produced by the tens of thousands each month at a cost of around $15 apiece. For the price of a single fighter aircraft, American industry could supply an entire squadron with drop tanks for months of continuous operations. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their fighters were designed for shorter-range interception missions around their fleet or island bases. Japanese drop tanks were scarce, crudely manufactured, prone to leakage, and tactically dismissed by many of their pilots. The young men selected for these pioneering missions from Iwo Jima were often new to the P-51, many having fewer than 10 hours in the cockpit before deploying to the volcanic island. They would learn through brutal, direct experience, or they would not survive. Captain Harry Krim, Jr. of the 72nd Fighter Squadron was a veteran at 23. The island itself remained a more immediate threat than the distant Japanese Air Force. With Japanese soldiers still emerging from hidden caves, pilots and ground crews had to carry weapons at all times. The nights were filled with the sound of gunfire and exploding grenades. By day, the meticulous preparations continued for the longest, most demanding fighter missions ever attempted. The first month on Iwo Jima was spent supporting the Marines in their final mop-up operations and conducting shorter-range strikes against nearby islands like Chichijima. These missions served as a vital training ground, allowing pilots to hone their skills in overwater navigation, a discipline utterly different from land-based flying, and to master the art of fuel conservation. The Packard Merlin engines proved remarkably reliable, but the planned 8-hour missions would push every component to its absolute limit. Spark plugs fouled easily in the humid, salty air. Oil consumption had to be monitored with obsessive attention. The slightest mechanical hiccup, a faulty fuel pump, a minor coolant leak, could translate into a death sentence over the endless Pacific. Ground crews, the unsung heroes of this campaign, worked 18-hour days in appalling conditions. They maintained the complex fighters in the open, with minimal equipment, their hands chafed by the abrasive volcanic dust that infiltrated every moving part. Their dedication kept the Mustangs flying, achieving readiness rates that would have been impressive even on a well-established stateside base. By early April 1945, 3 fighter groups were fully operational on Iwo Jima, the 15th, the 21st, and later the 506th Fighter Group. Together, they could muster over 100 Mustangs for a single mission. The stage was now set. Tokyo was 750 miles away. 750 miles of empty blue nothingness that Japanese planners had believed was their ultimate shield. That assumption was hours away from being systematically and permanently dismantled. The briefing for history. On April 6th, the pilots of the 15th Fighter Group assembled in a dusty operations tent, the air thick with tension and the smell of canvas and sweat. Major James Tapp spread his maps across a makeshift table and delivered the news with calm authority. The following day, they would make history. A nervous energy rippled through the room as pilots leaned in, studying the routes, performing mental calculations for fuel consumption, and absorbing the weather reports. The route was deceptively simple on paper. Fly north-northwest for approximately 3 hours at 10,000 feet, maintain strict formation discipline to conserve fuel, rendezvous with B-29s from the 73rd Bomb Wing just south of Tokyo, escort the bombers over their targets, engage any enemy fighters, and then fight their way home. The briefing officers were brutally honest about the stakes. This was a 1,500-mile round trip. They would be sealed in their cockpits for a minimum of 8 hours. There were no alternate landing sites. If a mechanical problem developed, a pilot would go down in the Pacific. While search and rescue would attempt recovery, the sheer scale of the ocean made a successful pickup a matter of chance more than certainty. The message was clear. Their survival depended on making it back to Iwo Jima, and that meant their lives depended on one thing above all else: fuel management. Every ounce of gasoline was precious. Every throttle adjustment, every deviation in altitude, every unnecessary maneuver would be paid for in the currency of range. They were instructed to fly smoothly, to avoid aggressive actions until their drop tanks were jettisoned, and to maintain formation as navigation over water without landmarks was a collective effort. To become separated was to become hopelessly lost. That night, ground crews worked under the dim glow of lanterns, preparing the 96 P-51Ds for their historic sortie. Every aircraft was inspected with an almost religious fervor. Engines were tuned to perfection. Fuel systems were checked and rechecked for the slightest leak. The 110-gallon drop tanks were filled and securely mounted. The fuselage tanks were topped off. Gun bays were loaded with 1,180 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition per aircraft. Oxygen systems, critical for hours at high altitude, were tested thoroughly. In this environment, a single mechanic's oversight could mean the death of a pilot. The long road to Tokyo. April 7th dawned clear and cold over Iwo Jima. At 0700 hours, the pilots began their elaborate pre-flight rituals, donning layers of clothing to combat the 40-degree staff temperatures they would encounter at altitude. They pulled on their flight suits, inflated their Mae West life preservers for inspection, strapped on parachutes, and checked their survival kits, each containing emergency rations, water, signal flares, a .45 caliber pistol, and shark repellent. The chances of surviving a ditching in the Pacific were slim, but these preparations represented a slender thread of hope. At 0745 hours, the morning stillness was shattered by the distinctive, powerful cough and roar of Packard Merlin engines sputtering to life across the island's airfields. The sound was a symphony of American industrial power. In their cockpits, pilots performed the final familiar checks. Fuel gauges reading full, oxygen flow confirmed, radio communication clear, drop tanks secure, gun sight activated, trim tabs set. The moment of truth had arrived. At 0800 hours precisely, the first flight of 4 P-51Ds began its takeoff roll down Central Field's runway, lifting sluggishly into the air, heavy with fuel. Within 20 minutes, all 96 Mustangs were airborne, a breathtaking spectacle of raw power and precision as they formed up into flights of 4, then squadrons of 16, then into a full armada of 3 groups. The immense formation then turned to a north-northwest heading and set course for Tokyo, the drone of their engines fading into the vastness of the sky. The journey north was a supreme test of endurance, concentration, and faith in machinery. Flying in tight formation for 3 hours demanded unrelenting focus. A slight variation in throttle setting could mean the difference between having sufficient fuel to return or facing a forced ditching. Pilots became fixated on their instrument panels, their eyes scanning the dials for fuel burn rate, oil pressure, and coolant temperature in a continuous, anxious loop. One B-29, with its more sophisticated navigation equipment and a dedicated navigator, flew ahead of the fighter stream, acting as a pathfinder. The Mustang pilots followed, clinging to their faith in this guide and the accuracy of their own calculations. Below them stretched an endless, featureless expanse of blue water. There were no ships, no islands, no visual references whatsoever, just an immense, empty canvas of ocean that offered no comfort and no room for error. In this sensory-deprived environment, pilots often experienced a psychological phenomenon known as enhanced hearing, imagining engine misfires and abnormalities that existed only in their stressed minds. Every slight fluctuation in engine pitch caused a jolt of adrenaline. The internal debate was constant. Is that engine running rough? Is my fuel consumption too high? Should I turn back now, while I still can, or press on and hope? About 2 hours into the flight, pilots began the critical procedure of switching to their fuselage tanks. It was essential to burn this 85-gallon reserve first, as the weight behind the cockpit made the Mustang dangerously tail-heavy and unresponsive. With a full fuselage tank, the aircraft handled like a truck, requiring constant back pressure on the control stick. They needed to burn this fuel quickly to regain the nimble, lethal handling that defined the P-51 before they reached combat. After 2 hours and 45 minutes, a miracle appeared on the horizon. The coast of Honshu, the Japanese mainland, materialized out of the haze, and there, standing sentinel, was the iconic, snow-capped peak of Mount Fuji, unmistakable even from 50 miles out. As Major Tapp would later recall, it was a sight straight out of a picture postcard, a beautiful and terrifying confirmation that they had done it. They had achieved the impossible. Single-engine American fighters were over the Japanese home islands. The sanctuary breached, combat over the empire. As the Mustang formation approached the rendezvous point south of Tokyo, pilots spotted their charges. The massive, four-engine B-29 superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing stacking into their combat formation. It was a spectacle of awesome and terrifying power. Each B-29 was a behemoth, over 99 feet long with a 141-foot wingspan, capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs. Together, this armada represented a destructive force capable of incinerating entire cities. And now, circling them protectively, were the 96 P-51 Mustangs, their polished aluminum skins gleaming like sharks in the sun. The moment the Mustangs crossed the coastline, a synchronized action took place across the formation. Pilots reached down and pulled the release handles for their external drop tanks. Instantly, 220 gallons of disposable fuel from each aircraft fell away, tumbling end over end into the sea below. The transformation was immediate and profound. The P-51s, suddenly freed from the drag and weight of the tanks, became light, agile, and supremely powerful. They were no longer long-range fuel tankers. They were now the deadliest fighters in the sky, capable of accelerating to 437 mph and outmaneuvering any opponent they were likely to meet. On the ground, Japanese radar operators had been tracking the incoming raid, but the data they were receiving seemed to indicate a system malfunction. A large formation of B-29s was expected, but the screens also showed dozens of smaller, faster blips, single-engine fighters. The operators checked and rechecked their equipment. It made no sense. The nearest American aircraft carriers were hundreds of miles away. Iwo Jima was in American hands, but the notion that they could operate fighters from there was preposterous. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The reports went up the chain of command, each level more skeptical than the last, until the visual confirmation came from the pilots themselves. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai received the scramble order at approximately 10:45 hours. At 29 years old, he was a legend, one of Japan's most experienced and decorated aces, with over 64 confirmed victories. A veteran of campaigns in China, the Philippines, and across the Pacific, he had survived horrific injuries, including a bullet wound to the head that had cost him the sight in his right eye. He was a master of his craft, supremely confident in his own abilities and in the legendary maneuverability of his Mitsubishi A6M50. He had no reason to doubt the intelligence assessments. Whatever was coming must be carrier-based F-6F Hellcats or F-4U Corsairs, formidable foes, but ones he understood and had faced before. The Zero that Sakai flew was the ultimate evolution of Japan's most famous fighter. The A6M5 Model 52 mounted two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns. Its Nakajima Sakai engine produced 1,130 horsepower, giving it a top speed of about 351 mph. Most importantly, it retained the Zero's legendary, almost supernatural maneuverability at low speeds. For years, Japanese combat doctrine had been built around this one advantage. Draw the enemy into a turning fight, use your superior turning radius, and victory would follow. This tactic had served them well in the early war. It was about to become obsolete. As Sakai climbed through 10,000 feet, he saw the American formation with his own eyes. His remaining eye widened at the scale of the raid. Over 100 B-29s, and with them, nearly 100 escorting fighters. They were definitely single-engine, but they were not the familiar shapes of Hellcats or Corsairs. These were different, sleeker, more streamlined, with elegant lines and bubble canopies that offered unparalleled visibility. They flew in tight, disciplined formations, and they moved with a speed and authority that was immediately alarming. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Services had scrambled every available fighter in the Tokyo Defense Zone, approximately 150 aircraft in total. There were Zeros, of course, but also Kawasaki Ki-61, Tonys, Nakajima Ki-84, Franks, and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars, a collection of the best fighters Japan could still put into the air. But by April 1945, these forces were a pale shadow of the elite units that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Crippling fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal training, sometimes as little as 40 to 70 total flight hours before being sent into combat. The veterans of 1941, who had averaged 700 hours, were mostly dead. Their replacements were brave but hopelessly outclassed. The clash of doctrine and technology. The first contact occurred at approximately 11:15 hours over Tokyo Bay. What transpired next was described by surviving Japanese pilots as their worst tactical nightmare realized. The American fighters, which intelligence would soon identify as P-51 Mustangs, possessed performance characteristics that seemed to defy physics. When Japanese pilots tried to engage, the Mustangs simply accelerated away, climbing with effortless power. The P-51's 86 mph speed advantage was an unbridgeable chasm in aerial combat. The Zeros that had once dominated the skies now found themselves outrun, outclimbed, and outdived. Lieutenant Sakai made his first attack run on a P-51 that seemed separated from its formation. He dove from above, building speed, and closed to firing range. As he pressed the trigger for his 20-minute cannons, the American pilot saw him coming, made a slight, energy-efficient turn, and simply powered away. Sakai's Zero, at its maximum speed in the dive, could not close the distance. He was stunned. He had never encountered an enemy fighter that could dismiss him so easily. This scene repeated itself across the sky. Japanese pilots, trained to seek the turning fight, found that their opponents refused to comply. American tactics, honed in the European theater and specifically taught for the Pacific, were brutally effective. Never dogfight a Zero. Use your superior speed and power in boom and zoom attacks. Dive from altitude with a tremendous speed advantage, fire a short, concentrated burst from optimal range, and then use your retained energy to climb back to safety, reset, and repeat. The Japanese had no answer for this. They could not force the Mustangs to fight on their terms. Captain Felix Scott of the 46th Fighter Squadron exemplified this tactical superiority. Spotting 3 Zeros below him, he rolled over and dove, building speed to over 400 mph. He singled out the trailing Zero, fired a burst from 400 yards, saw his tracers strike the enemy's wing and engine, and then, without a moment's hesitation, used his speed to zoom climb back to 20,000 feet. The other 2 Zeros, unable to match his climb rate, were left circling impotently below. He had taken his shot without ever entering their effective engagement envelope. Major James Tapp emerged as the star of the day, using these textbook tactics to claim 4 confirmed victories. His gun camera footage would later provide a masterclass in energy fighting. He would approach Japanese formations at high speed, fire precise bursts from 300-500 yards, and then immediately extend away and reposition. The Japanese fighters never had a chance to effectively return fire. Over the target, the B-29s encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire, but fighter opposition was disorganized and largely ineffective. The P-51 escorts had broken up the Japanese attacks before they could coherently form against the bombers. When the occasional Japanese pilot did press home an attack on a B-29, a flight of Mustangs would scream down to intercept, forcing them to break off or be destroyed. The escort concept was working exactly as planned. The air battle over Tokyo lasted about 15 minutes of intense, chaotic combat. When it was over, the results were starkly indicative of the new balance of power. American pilots claimed 21 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with 1 probable and 5 damaged. Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighters managed to shoot down only 2 P-51s. A third pilot was lost to a mechanical failure. The exchange ratio was devastating, over 10-1 in America's favor. Most critically, only 3 B-29s were lost, a far lower attrition rate than was typical for unescorted raids. The true victory, however, was psychological. Japanese pilots returned to their bases shaken and demoralized. They reported encountering a new type of American fighter that was faster, more powerful, and possessed of seemingly magical range. The implications were catastrophic. If American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Tokyo and back, then Japan's air defenses were fundamentally broken. There was no sanctuary, no safe airspace in which to regroup, retrain, or even breathe. The harrowing return and the dawn of a new era. The return flight to Iwo Jima was an ordeal that tested the pilots as severely as the combat had. After over 6 hours in their cockpits, they were physically drained and mentally exhausted. The intense focus of combat had burned through their energy reserves, and now the relentless monitoring of the fuel gauges began again. For some, the numbers were terrifyingly low. Pilots spotted the faint, smoky outline of Iwo Jima on the horizon with less than 30 minutes of fuel remaining, the volcanic island appearing as the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. One by one, the Mustangs descended into the landing pattern, their engines coughing on the last vapors of fuel. Gear down, flaps extended, they touched down on the rough, steel-matted runways and rolled to a stop. Pilots climbed out on trembling, stiff legs, their bodies aching, their minds struggling to process the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. They were immediately mobbed by ground crews, desperate for news. Did you make it? Did you see Mount Fuji? What were they like? The pilots, in their exhaustion, could only offer terse, weary answers. They had made history. They had proven that the vast Pacific was no longer a barrier, but a highway for American air power. For intelligence officers, the debriefings began immediately. Every detail was critical. Exact fuel consumption, engine performance at various power settings, the behavior of Japanese fighters, their tactics, their apparent skill level. Gun camera footage was developed and analyzed frame by frame. The data extracted from this first mission would refine tactics, improve planning, and validate the entire Very Long Range (VLR) fighter concept for the campaigns to come. For Japanese military planners, April 7, 1945, marked a fundamental turning point. The core assumption of their homeland defense strategy had been invalidated. Within days, intelligence confirmed the identity of the new fighter, the P-51 Mustang, operating from Iwo Jima. Analysis of its capabilities was deeply discouraging. It was not merely an adequate long-range escort, it was arguably the best all-around fighter in the world, and it was now operating in strength over the Japanese homeland. Japanese engineers studied the P-51 specifications with a sense of despair. The Packard Merlin's 1,095 horsepower dwarfed the Zero's 1,030. The Mustang's combination of speed, range, firepower, and high-altitude performance was something they could not match with any existing design. The drop tank technology, so simple and yet so effective, was a logistical and industrial feat beyond Japan's crippled capacity. Saburo Sakai captured the sentiment in his post-war writings. Today I saw the future, and it belongs to America. We are defending our homeland with aircraft designed 5 years ago. They are attacking us with the most advanced fighter in the world. The campaign intensifies, the grinding down of Japan's air power. The strategic implications were immediate and profound. With fighter escort, B-29s could now bomb from lower altitudes with greater accuracy and far lower losses. The incendiary raids on Japanese cities, already devastating, became apocalyptic in their efficiency. By mid-April, the 21st and 506th Fighter Groups were fully operational, giving the 7th Fighter Command over 150 Mustangs. The missions intensified rapidly. On April 12th, another major escort mission struck Tokyo. On April 16th, the Mustangs conducted their first independent fighter sweep, a raid of 57 aircraft that strafed Koriyama Airfield, catching Japanese aircraft on the ground and further attriting their dwindling strength. The psychological impact was relentless. American fighters could now appear anywhere, at any time. The Japanese response evolved, but their options were vanishingly small. They could not produce a fighter to match the Mustang. Their aircraft industry was being systematically destroyed by the very B-29s the Mustangs were protecting. They could not train adequate pilots due to the catastrophic fuel shortage. They could not match American logistics. The tactical playbook was useless against an enemy that refused to play by its rules. A stark reminder that the Pacific itself was often a deadlier foe than the Japanese came on June 1st, 1945, a day forever known as Black Friday to the Mustang groups. A formation of 148 P-51s en route to Osaka flew into a massive, unforeseen weather front. The result was catastrophic. The formation was torn apart by violent turbulence inside towering thunderstorms. Pilots, flying completely blind, suffered spatial disorientation. Several aircraft collided. Others spun out of control and dove into the ocean. In a single tragic day, 27 Mustangs were lost and 24 pilots killed, not one to enemy action. It was a somber lesson in the absolute, unforgiving brutality of the operational environment. Despite such tragedies, the rescue services developed for these VLR missions became a remarkable story of dedication and courage. A dedicated lifeguard system was established, with submarines and destroyer escorts stationed along the route, and PBY Catalina flying boats patrolling designated search sectors. This system proved incredibly effective, rescuing approximately 60% of all downed airmen, a statistic that provided immense moral comfort to the pilots embarking on these perilous journeys. By July 1945, the character of the air war had changed completely. Organized Japanese fighter opposition had markedly decreased. The High Command, recognizing the hopelessness of contesting air superiority with their remaining modern aircraft, was preserving them for the anticipated Allied invasion, planning to use them in massed kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet. Consequently, many P-51 missions now encountered only sporadic aerial resistance. The Mustangs shifted their focus to ground attack, strafing airfields, factories, and transportation networks across Japan. These strafing missions were, in many ways, more dangerous than air combat. Flying at low altitude through concentrated, accurate light anti-aircraft fire was a terrifying and deadly business. Many Mustangs returned to Iwo Jima riddled with bullet holes, but the campaign was devastatingly effective. Between April and August 1945, P-51s from Iwo Jima were credited with destroying or damaging over 1,000 Japanese aircraft on the ground, systematically obliterating what remained of Japan's air power, one airfield at a time. The legacy of the Mustang over Tokyo. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the Mustangs of Iwo Jima had flown 51 major combat missions to the Japanese home islands. They had escorted hundreds of B-29 sorties, conducted dozens of fighter sweeps, and established an absolute, uncontested air superiority that paved the way for the final decisive blows of the war, including the atomic bombings, which were delivered by B-29s operating in a near-permissive environment. The final statistics told a story of overwhelming dominance. The 7th Fighter Command's P-51s were credited with 206 aerial victories in the campaign. American losses totaled approximately 180 aircraft, but fewer than 30 of those were shot down by Japanese fighters. The rest were victims of the ocean, the weather, and mechanical failure. The steep operational loss tax paid for pushing technology and human endurance to their absolute limits. The legacy of those missions over Tokyo is profound. The P-51 Mustang's appearance on April 7, 1945, was more than a tactical event. It was a strategic and psychological watershed. It demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, technological superiority, mass production, and superior training are ultimately decisive. The brave spirit of the Japanese pilot, the legendary maneuverability of the Zero, the depth of their national resolve, none of it could withstand the relentless material reality represented by the silver Mustangs circling overhead. For Saburo Sakai and his comrades, those fighters were the harbingers of a final, inescapable truth. They were not just aircraft. They were the embodiment of American industrial might, engineering genius, and logistical prowess. They were the conclusive argument in a long and brutal war, proving that the sanctuary of distance was an illusion, and that the sky over the empire now belonged to its enemies. The shockwaves of that first mission did not just ripple through the military command. They reverberated through the very soul of a nation, shattering the last vestiges of hope and accelerating the inevitable end.